I'm sure we would all like to think of the place where we live as being a peaceful and a harmonious place in which there is no agony and no difficulties whatsoever. However, I have to share with you that if you live in the United States of America, you will find that we have a history of repeated violence and protest here that goes back to our very beginning, and it continues even today. So what we're going to do today is take a look at the history of protest in the United States of America. Protest. Yes, protest. Lots of it has happened. Lots will continue to happen. It goes back and is concerned with the First Amendment to the Constitution, where it has told us that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And there is the difference. Is it peaceable or not? We can start with the Indian Massacre of 1622. Braves of the Pohatan tribe, according to this quotation, came unarmed into our houses with deer, turkeys, fish, and fruits, and other provisions to sell us. The Powhatan grabbed any tools or weapons available and killed all the English settlers they found, including men, women, and children of all ages. The chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, in a coordinated series of surprise attacks, killed 347 people, a quarter of the population of the Virginia colony. The Pequot Wars. The Pequot War is an armed conflict that took place early part of the 1600s in New England between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of colonists of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies, and their allies were the Indians, the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes. The war concluded with a decisive defeat of the Pequots. At the end, about 700 Pequots had been killed or taken into captivity. Hundreds of protesters were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Other survivors were dispersed as captives to the victorious tribes. It was not nice. They were being very unhospitable. Famously, King Philip's War, sometimes called the First Indian War or Metacomet's War, an armed conflict, 1865 to 78, between the Indians of New England and the New England colonists and their allies. It's named for this Wampanoag chief Metacomet, who adopted the name Philip because he originally had friendly relations between, there had been friendly relations between his father Massasoit and the Mayflower Pilgrims. The war continued in the most northern reaches of New England until the signing of the Treaty of Casco Bay in 1678. Bacon's Rebellion. An armed rebellion took place in the western part of Virginia. Nathaniel Bacon led a group of people against Governor William Berkeley. His grievances were basically that he had refused to allow Bacon to take place in trading with the Native Americans, and this was a very lucrative thing to do. He had refused Bacon a military commission would allow him to fight and attack the Native Americans at his own discretion. The attacks by some Indians are credited with inciting the popular uprising against Berkeley for failing to address the demands of the colonists regarding safety on the frontier. These Indian Dogue people had both traded and made war on the Virginia frontier. Leisler's Rebellion took place in New York, colonial New York. A German-American merchant and militia captain seized control of the colony's south and ruled it from 1689 to 1691. This took place in the aftermath of Britain's Glorious Revolution. And so the rebellion reflected colonial resentment against the policies of deposed King James II. Other colonial rebellions, and there's a long list of them. Note there are some slave rebellions here, and this will become an increasingly important problem for America as we move through the centuries. And you see a couple of slave revolts that are mentioned here, but also election revolts, tenant revolts, all kinds of things where people felt they were being abused. But there was one after the other after the other. Benjamin Franklin organizes what's called the Albany Congress in 1754, or the Albany Convention of 1754, a meeting of representatives by the legislatures of 7 out of the 13 colonies. What they wanted to discuss was better relations with the American Indian tribes and defense against the French threat from Canada. Now, 1754 is a few years before the French and Indian War. And so the French were a continuing problem along with the Indians. His Albany plan of union would create a unified level of colonial government. The delegates voted approval of a plan that called for a union of 11 colonies with a president appointed by the British Crown. The plan was rejected, unfortunately, by the colonies' legislatures, but many of the elements of this plan were going to resurface in the Articles of Confederation a few years later. The disjointed snake that you see there, which says in the cartoon, "Join or die," was arguably the first political cartoon that had ever been devised. Pontiac's War out in the West. Launched in 1763, a loose confederation of Indian tribes, and we know Pontiac, of course, as the name that was adopted for the very famous automobile, which is no longer made, was out in the basically Great Lakes region. The warriors from numerous tribes joined in the uprising in effort to drive the British soldiers out of the region. And the most prominent of these Indian leaders was Pontiac. The Stamp Act of 1765, Act of Parliament of Great Britain, which imposed a direct tax on the British colonies. British had financed the French and Indian War, sometimes called in the rest of the world the 7 Years' War, and it had been expensive for them. And a lot of it had been because they were fighting the French on the frontier of their colonies. And they correctly thought that it was only proper that the colonies should pay some of the expenses. Now, this follows upon about 150 years in which the British have pretty much left the colonies alone. It was called benign neglect, salutary neglect. And now they're going to impose taxes, and they're going to impose them on virtually anything that is printed. Legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, almost anything that you could imagine. And so everybody saw the tax every time that they did a commercial activity, every time they bought something or used something. And so it was a direct tax, and it was right in their face all the time. And so there was great resentment because it was taxation without representation. There were no representatives in Parliament from the colonies where when this was imposed. And so a Stamp Act Congress was held in New York City. This becomes the first significant joint colonial response to any British measure, and it was called to petition the Parliament and the King. They weren't ready to leave the relationship yet, but they want to protest and protest loudly. Most famously, a Boston Massacre takes place in March of 1770. It's early March, I might note. British soldiers shot and killed several people while they were being harassed by a mob of people who had gathered. Among the tense relations between the civilians and the soldiers, the mob formed around the British sentry verbally abused him. He was eventually supported by 7 additional soldiers who were hit by clubs, stones, and snowballs. And by the way, the snowballs probably had rocks inside of them. Eventually, one soldier fired, prompting the others to fire without an order by their commander. The gunfire instantly killed 3 people and wounded 8 others, 2 later died of their wounds. And so the death of these 5 becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And it takes place, as you'll note, in Boston Commons, and it's done late at night. This is around 10 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock in early March. It's dark. And so it's possible that great error took place. This is a copy of the engraving that's done by Paul Revere. It's circulated to all the other colonies, and of course it portrays the British soldiers as acting brutally towards the poor defenseless colonists. The Boston Tea Party, a political and mercantile protest by the Sons of Liberty, who were disguised themselves as Indians, and they boarded the British East India Company ships that were there, and they threw the tea into the harbor, and it was worth millions of dollars. And they wanted to make their point that there could not be any, as a part of taxation, without any representation. The British East India Company was given this monopoly to sell their tea. The government in Great Britain responded harshly and as one of the steps escalating into the American Revolution. Later on, you'll find that there are movements in this country that take the term, the Tea Party movement, and in fact, a lot of the people who are protesting on January 6th in our Capitol building have their origins in the Tea Party movement of a few years ago. The American Revolution is protest, colonial revolt, which occurred between 1765 and 1783. 13 colonies ultimately defeat the British, but now I need to note it was with the assistance of France, because we probably couldn't have done this alone. Again, it was proclaiming no taxation without representation, starting with the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. And one wonders, if they had provided representation, would we in fact have had the American Revolution? And we'll never know that, because it didn't happen. The protests escalated through the Boston Massacre, the burning of a ship called the Gaspé in Rhode Island, and the Boston Tea Party. The British responded by closing Boston Harbor, enacted a series of punitive laws which effectively rescinded Massachusetts Bay's colonies' right of self-government. Remember, I said they've been doing this self-government for 150 years. They deeply resent these people 3,000 miles away in London trying to meddle in their well-managed affairs. The other colonies, of course, rallied behind Massachusetts, and a group of American patriot leaders set up their own government in late 1774. The other colonies rallied behind Massachusetts, and a group of American patriot leaders came together and set up their own government in late 1774 at the First Continental Congress. They want to coordinate their resistance to Britain, but they were still loyalists or Tories. They had not yet gone their own way. They were going to do that a year later, but at this point, they had not yet done it. Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts was an armed uprising. The farmers in Western Massachusetts had lots of assets in terms of land, but they had very little cash. And they were expected to pay their taxes in cash, which they couldn't do. And so they were going to protest that they were being treated unfairly. And so they led 4,000 rebels. 4,000 of them came together. And they were veterans, many of them, of the Revolutionary War. And they marched on the Federal Springfield Armory in an unsuccessful attempt to seize its weaponry and overthrow the government. And they found that they weren't able to put that down easily. And so they until the state of Massachusetts then used its own militia to go and put this down. But the federal government, the national government, was unable to act effectively. And this frightened people. Here we have a national government under the Articles of Confederation, and they're unable to put down a rebellion within our borders. and that frightened people. And so it was part of the reason why in 1787 there was a constitutional convention to consider a stronger government. 1791, we had the Whiskey Rebellion, a tax protest in Western Pennsylvania mostly. It's called, what they did, corn was one of the main products that was produced. Corn is very heavy and very expensive to transport, and to make it into something more valuable, they were turning it into rum and whiskey, and so that then well, it could be taxed and transported and so forth, and so they needed money. The government at that time, the new government under George Washington, needed money in order to pay for the expenses of the American Revolution, which had still been hanging on for the last 10 years. And so this became known as the whiskey tax, and the people resented it very greatly, and they rose up in rebellion. Now, Washington is able to mount a military response, and they go out, and the people fold their tent, and they give up. So it doesn't get out of hand. And government does establish the principle that it can tax certain kinds of things. And to this day, it still taxes all kinds of adult beverages. Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner, also known as the Southampton insurrection, took place in late August of 1831. Slaves organized by Nat Turner decided to assert their freedom, and so they killed 55 to 65 people, at least 51 of them being white. The rebellion was put down after a few days. Turner himself survived for 2 months, and was eventually, this was put down. But the widespread fear as a result of this, would the slaves rise up in Georgia? Would they rise up in South Carolina? Would they rise up in North Carolina? Would they rise up in more in Virginia? And so the state executed 56 slaves. They then said that they could not be given any education. And in fact, in their churches, where they felt much of this was being organized, they had a white minister or a white observer. The slaves soon learned that they would communicate their secret ideas and messages through their songs and through their words. And so they managed to keep a sense of independence that way. Murder of Elijah Lovejoy in 1837, an American Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor, and more importantly, an abolitionist. He was shot and killed by a pro-slavery mob in Alton, Illinois, during the attack on the warehouse of Benjamin Godfrey to destroy Lovejoy's press and abolitionist materials. According to John Quincy Adams, the murder gave a shock as of an earthquake throughout this country. And this became, in fact, a symbolic thing. If you're going to destroy the press of somebody who's an abolitionist, what else will they do? This is where John Brown makes his vow. Here, before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. John Brown begins to become intense at that point. The Know-Nothings were actually called the American Party, but they were known as the Know-Nothings because when asked, what are you doing? They would say, oh, I don't know, nothing. And so they became known that way. There were different violent acts that occurred. There was one called Bloody Monday in Louisville, Kentucky in 1855. In 1856, a riot in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1857, one in Washington, D.C. In 1858, one in New Orleans. It's about when the Know-Nothing Party is going to disappear. And where did they go? Well, they become part of what is the new Republican Party, which was founded in 1854. This is our friend John Brown, Potawatomi Massacre in 1856. Reaction to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery forces. Brown and a band of his abolitionist friends Some members of what were called the Potawatomi Rifles killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. This was one of the many violent episodes in Kansas preceding the American Civil War, which came to be known collectively as Bleeding Kansas. There were a number of conflicts out in Kansas during this period, and their basic issue was Kansas going to enter the Union as a slave state or a free state, sitting where they were members of both groups, and it does not become a state until after the Civil War has started. John Brown then leads a raid on Harper's Ferry, which at that time was part of Virginia, today is West Virginia. They wanted to initiate a slave, that's what he wanted to do, initiate a slave revolt in the southern states. He thought, if I get them going, if I arm them. And so he was going into the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he's going to get all the rifles and the ammunition he can so that the slaves can be armed for their insurrection. He had a party of 22 who came with him, and they were defeated by a company of U.S. Marines. Among the interesting footnotes here is Colonel Robert E. Lee was in overall command of the operation to retake the arsenal. Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart were part of the troops guarding the arrested Brown. And also, of interest, John Wilkes Booth, the man who will later assassinate Lincoln, was a spectator at this execution. There had been a request to have Tubman and Douglas there, but neither of them could join him in this effort. And of course, the greatest protest of all is the American Civil War itself, 1861 to 1865. And it was states' rights, of course, but it's primarily about slavery. And the South wanted its right to maintain slavery. And the abolitionists and the North said, no, you're not going to do that. And so from April of 1861 at Fort Sumter through until we get into the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. Loyalists of the Union in the North included some geographically western and southern states proclaimed support for the Constitution, and they faced segregationists of the Confederate States who advocated for states' rights. And it was a bloody affair with perhaps 700,000 deaths out of a population of maybe 31 or 32 million people. New York draft riots in 1863. The Union needed more soldiers, and by 1863, they decided they would institute the first draft. And of course, that was a lot of resentment. And interesting that many of the people who were going to be drafted were Irish Americans. And they were working class white men. And they feared that Black people were going to compete for their work, and they resented the wealthier men. Wealthier men could pay $300, which is the equivalent of something over $6,000 today, a commutation fee to hire a substitute, and they were spared from the draft. There was a lot of resentment. Now, the draft riots took place, but they were, of course, put down by soldiers that Lincoln sent in there from the aftermath of the Gettysburg battles. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, sometimes called the Great Upheaval. The strike lasted for 69 days. It was put down by unofficial militias, National Guard, federal troops. An estimated 100 people were killed in the unrest across the country. And there was a fear that this was going to spread and become part of a greater movement like the Paris Commune of 1871. At the time, unions were not represented by trade unions. Unionization had not yet taken place. And despite disruption was widespread, and its height, the strikes were supported by 100,000 workers, which in that time would have been a tremendous number. The intervention of federal troops at several locations, most of the strikes were suppressed fairly quickly. The Haymarket Riots, also known as the Haymarket Massacre, in the aftermath of a bombing that took place at a labor demonstration at Haymarket Square in Chicago. It had begun as a peaceful rally in support of workers striking for an 8-hour workday. The day after, police killed and injured several workers, and somehow an unknown person threw a dynamite bomb at the police as they acted to disperse the meeting, and the bomb blast and ensuing gunfire resulted in the death of police officers and civilians. Dozens of others were wounded. This was anarchism. In the internationally publicized legal proceedings that followed, 8 anarchists were convicted of the conspiracy. The evidence was that one of the defendants may have built the bomb, but none of those on trial had thrown it. 7 were sentenced to death and 1 to a term of 15 years. The governor commuted 2 of the sentences to terms of life in prison. Another committed suicide in jail rather than face the gallows. The other 4 were hanged, and a little later, another governor pardoned the remaining defendants and criticized the trial. What is this thing called anarchy? Modern anarchism was a significant part of the workers' movement, alongside Marxism at the end of the 19th century. Modernism, industrialization, reaction to capitalism, and mass migration helped anarchism to flourish and to spread around the globe. Major schools of thought of anarchism sprouted up as anarchism grew as a social movement. And you see these different versions of anarchism. As the workers' movement grew, the divide between the anarchists and Marxists grew as well. They start out together, but then they have a divide. The 2 currents formally split at the 5th Congress of the First International, 1872. Anarchists participated enthusiastically in the Russian Revolution, but as soon as the Bolsheviks established their authority, the anarchists were harshly suppressed, and they move on to other things. The anthropology of anarchism has changed in the contemporary era as the traditional lines or ideas of the 19th century have been abandoned. Most anarchists now are younger activists informed with feminist and ecological concerns. They're involved in counterculture, black power, creating temporary autonomous zones, and so forth. These movements are not anarchists, but anarchistic. Anarchy assassinations took place during this period in the late 19th and into the 20th century. Haymarket Riot, one of the causes of that was an anarchist. And you see here where we have these different people. The Empress Elizabeth of Austria is stabbed by an anarchist. King of Italy, Umberto I, is assassinated by an anarchist. Our own President, William McKinley, is shot by an anarchist, and so forth. And so we have a number of these taking place during this period. By 1920, anarchism itself fades into the background. Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike, also known as the Homestead Steal or Homestead Massacre, industrial lockout and strike, which began in July 1892. The battle was a pivotal event. Occurred at the steel works in Pittsburgh, at the town of Homestead, between iron workers and the Carnegie Steel Company. The final result was a major defeat for union workers and a setback for their efforts to unionize steel workers. We aren't going to have real unionization take place until the 1930s. Then we have the Pullman Strike. The Pullman Strike, a nationwide railroad strike. The Pullman Strike was a nationwide railroad strike in the United States that lasted from May 11th to July 20th, 1894, and was a turning point for U.S. labor law. And the strike and boycott shut down much of the nation's freight and passenger traffic west of Detroit. And in those days, that's how virtually everything moved. It moved by train. There were, of course, no airplanes at that point, and cars and roads were certainly inadequate during that time. Many of the Pullman factory workers joined the American Railway Union, led by socialist, later 3-time president for candidate Eugene B. Debs, supported their strike by launching a boycott. The conflict began in Pullman, Chicago, when nearly 4,000 factory employees of the Pullman Company began a wildcat strike in response to recent reduction in wages. A total of 30 workers were killed. Most of the factory workers who built Pullman cars, now Pullman cars were people's sleeping cars, very important when you traveled a distance during the 19th century. It was a company town. Pullman on the south side of Chicago. The industrialist George Pullman had designed it ostensibly as a model community to take good care of his precious employees. He had a diverse workforce. He wanted to hire African Americans for certain jobs, and he used ads and other campaigns to bring workers into the company. Coal strike of 1902, known as the anthracite coal strike, by the United Mine Workers of America in the anthracite coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania. The strike threatened to shut down the winter fuel supply to American cities. At the time, residences were typically heated with anthracite or hard coal, which produces higher heat value and less smoke than soft or bituminous coal. I don't even know where you would buy bitumen or anthracite coal today. It's hard to come by. Pretty much most of it has been already mined and used. The strike never resumed as the miners received a 10% wage increase and reduced workdays from 10 to 9 hours. The owners got a higher price for coal and didn't recognize the trade union as a bargaining agent. It was the first labor dispute in which the US government plays a role. And guess who the arbitrator is? It's Teddy Roosevelt. And this is a real star in his crown of his presidency. Women's suffrage. Although the movement for women's right to vote actually began earlier than this, but in the latter half of the 19th century, women became very activist, and there were many leaders who played a major role. They were doing this in Great Britain as well. They felt their time had come to be equal. A suffrage parade in 1913 on the eve of President Wilson's inauguration was marred by violence, but also it redoubled the effort of the women to organize. Sometimes women got involved too. There's a famous march by the black sorority Delta Sigma Theta, where they marched with white women. In 1916 and 17, suffragists picketed the White House with one silent picket leading to the arrest of 218 women from 26 states. They were jailed and force-fed at a prison in Virginia. Their mistreatment led to public outrage and helped to provide sympathy for their campaign to get women's suffrage. And it finally comes in the 19th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote, passing Congress in 1919, and it is rapidly ratified by 2/3 of the states, Tennessee being the last one in August of 1920. And so in the November election of 1920, women can vote for the first time. Race riots. Race riots are interwoven throughout the United States history. And I hear people today who say, we do not have systemic racism. I don't know where they have been. Systemic racism is woven into every fabric of America from the very beginning, and it shows up very violently at times. And there were, in fact, many, many race riots. I've already mentioned some of the attempts on the part of African Americans to achieve some level of independence. But here, especially after World War I, we see an explosion of them. Here is a list of some of them: St. Louis, Missouri, and East St. Louis, Chester, Pennsylvania, Springfield, Missouri, Houston, Texas, Seattle, Washington. Then there are the Red Summer race riots of 1919. And I'm just going to list these a little bit, one at a time. And just note that all of these places: Georgia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Georgia, Connecticut, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Connecticut, Maryland, Mississippi, Arizona, Georgia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Alabama, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, Texarkana, Texas, New York, Knoxville, and so forth and so on. There's just a lot of race riots that go on. Is race interwoven in the riots into our fabric? Yes, they are. Then we have the famous Boston police strike. And this one, the Boston police officers went on strike in September of 1919. They sought recognition of their trade union and improved wages and working conditions. And they go back and forth at each other, and they cannot come to an agreement. And so they then have a strike. During the strike, Boston experienced several nights of lawlessness. Remember, the police are not out enforcing the law. Several thousand members of the Massachusetts State Guard, supported by volunteers, restored order by force. Press reaction and locally and nationally described the strike as Bolshevik inspired, communist inspired. We had one of the first red scares we have in our country. They were called deserters and agents of Lenin. Samuel Gompers of the AFL recognized the strike was damaging the cause of labor in the public mind and told the strikers, go back to work. And the commissioner refused to rehire the policeman, and he was supported by then Governor Calvin Coolidge, whose rebuke of Gompers earned him a national reputation. 9 were killed in several days of civil unrest and the threat of a general strike. It was a terrible, terrible event. All striking workers with 1,500 new officers were hired, were given higher wages. The strike was a setback for labor unions, and of course it was a step up for Calvin Coolidge. The next year he was the vice presidential candidate.
September 9th, 1919. 10,000 people gather in Scully Square in Boston, Massachusetts. Rocks are thrown at streetcars. Stores are looted and destroyed. Who is to blame for this chaos? Since 1857, the pay for new Boston police officers was only $2 per day. Furthermore, strict working hours and poor conditions in police stations only exacerbated the situation.
New recruits only got $2 per day. That's less than the wages of unskilled factory workers. We were required to work 7 days per week, and we could only take a day off every 2 weeks. Even then, we weren't allowed to leave town without permission. Our biggest complaint was the stations. Some of us were required to sleep at the stations at night in case they needed us, but they didn't have any beds, baths, or toilets.
The police grew fatigued from the unchanging conditions, so they decided to form a union.
We decided, like any other group of American workers, that we would form a union, and so we did. We were even affiliated with the AFL, and that really upset Mr. Curtis.
1,100 out of 1,500 officers joined the union. When Police Commissioner Edwin Curtis heard about it, he suspended 19 of the union's officers. A strike was inevitable.
We planned the strike for September 9th at 5:45 p.m. Over 1,000 of us walked out. Commissioner Curtis and Governor Coolidge knew about our plans, so it wasn't a surprise to them.
Governor Calvin Coolidge ordered the National Guard to patrol Boston during the time of the strike. Riots commenced that night as criminals looted many stores.
There were a lot of riots that night and the following nights. Criminals took advantage of the lack of police officers to rob stores and commit other crimes. We didn't support anything that happened that night. We just did what we had to do.
The striking police officers were never allowed to return to work. Commissioner Curtis was able to hire a completely new police force by mid-December.
Then we have the steel strike of 1919, an attempt by a weakened iron and steel workers to organize the United States steel industry after World War I. And this was a strike in September of 1919, which is going to last for about 3 or 4 months. And it was a craft union and deeply committed to that cause. And it was, and then there's the very famous Tulsa race riots. That took place in Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, late May into June. Mobs of white residents attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack carried out on the ground and from private aircraft destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district, at that time the wealthiest Black community in the United States. Some called it Black Wall Street. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals. As many as 6,000 Black residents were interned for several days. Officially recording 36 dead. 2001 State Commission confirmed 39 dead, 26 Black, 13 white. The commission estimates, however, that it could be somewhere between 75 to 300 who died, because the record are very imprecise. It was a nasty time. It was racism at its very worst. People would get into a truck and they'd stand in the back of the truck and they drive down the street with their guns shooting at anyone they could see. Famously, the Ku Klux Klan Washington marches. In the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was at the peak of its membership with perhaps 3 million members. The total population of the United States was only about 115 million. It was a big percentage, largely out in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. The growth of the hate group was fueled by the 1915 release of the silent film Birth of a Nation, which portrayed members as heroes, coinciding with the widespread xenophobia following the devastation of World War I. Their hatred was directed not only against Black people, but also against European Catholic and Jewish immigrants who had come in large numbers into the United States. In 1925 and 1926, the Klan descended on Washington, D.C. in 2 major marches. And they couldn't decide whether they were going to let them march or not. They finally did allow them to march, 50,000 Klansmen in this conclave, but they were not allowed to wear their famous hoods while they marched. Coxey's Army and Cox's Army, 2 Coxeys. Coxey's Army was a protest march by unemployed workers from Ohio in 1894. It's the second year of a major depression, and they officially called the Army of the Commonwealth in Christ. Its nickname came from its leader, and that was that they wanted to have enough food to feed Coxey's Army. That phrase comes out. Anyway, it was a major protest march on Washington. The next one, however, is COX, and that comes in 1932, a march of 250,000 unemployed Pennsylvanians. They wanted to change the inheritance tax and so forth. They wanted to wrest the Republican nomination for president away from Hoover. Hoover was sufficiently embarrassed. Full-scale investigation took place, and the Republican National Committee wanted to know how Cox was able to purchase enough gasoline to get the marchers to Washington, suggesting the Vatican or Democratic supporters of Al Smith. Turned out that Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Miller, who would be later, had quietly ordered his Gulf oil gas stations to dispense free gas. And that was why he was then removed as Secretary of the Treasury. Bonus Army. In 1924, Congress had decided to give a bonus to the veterans of World War I, but it was not going to be something that they could collect until 1948. That bonus, along with compounded interest, would be a significant amount of money. However, by 1932, the Depression had made everybody very desperate and out of income. And so they wanted their money now. So they marched on Washington and they formed an encampment, kind of a shanty town. And finally, they ordered that was going to be cleared out. Herbert Hoover orders the U.S. Army to clear the marchers' campsite. And it is Army Chief of Staff at that time, General Douglas MacArthur, who would later on become famous in World War II, who goes in and he's supported by 6 tanks and a contingent of infantry, and they clean them out. And it's a disasterly thing. And of course, there's movies that are being taken, and those are showing up in the newsreels in the movie theaters throughout the country. And so it is a very big black mark for President Hoover that he has done this. Now, just as a matter of footnote, where was the bonus armies camp? It's where the Pentagon is today in Washington, D.C. More race riots. 1935, Harlem. 43, Beaumont, Texas. 43, Los Angeles. Detroit in 1943, a major race riot as a result of so many Southerners, blacks moving north to work in the different industries of the North. Another Harlem riot, 43, Columbia, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, Cambridge riot in 1963, race riots, discontent, Chester, Pennsylvania, Ford Hunger March. The Ford Hunger March, sometimes called the Ford Massacre, took place in March of 1932. Unemployed auto workers. It ended in Dearborn, Michigan, a confrontation in which 4 workers were shot to death by the Dearborn Police Department and security guards employed by the Ford Motor Company. More than 60 workers were injured. 3 months later, a 5th worker died. The march was organized by the Unemployed Councils, a project of the Communist Party USA, which was very active during the 1930s. Important chain of events that resulted in the unionization of the U.S. auto industry. 1934, West Coast waterfront strike. The longshoremen, these are the guys who unload all of the ships. They had a strike that lasted for 83 days, in which longshoremen in every West Coast port walked out. The strike peaked with the death of 2 workers on what they call Bloody Thursday. And it stopped everything out in that country out at that time. The result of the strike was the unionization of all the West Coast ports of the U.S. And so we have several other strikes taking place during this time, and communists are playing some role in many of these during this time. And much of this is organized by CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which later is going to be merged with the AFL, the American Federation of Federation of Labor. It becomes the AFL-CIO, but right at this point, it's a separate organization. The Old Miss riots of 1962, the Battle of Oxford between Southern segregationists and federal and state forces. Segregationists were protesting the enrollment of James Meredith, a black U.S. military veteran at the University of Mississippi, which had been exclusively white up till that point, affectionately known as Old Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. 2 civilians, 1 a French journalist, were killed during the night, and over 300 people were injured, including 1/3 of the federal law enforcement that was there. Race riots in 1964. James Powell killed by police in Yorkville, part of East Harlem. And so we have Harlem riots in 1964, Rochester, New York, Jersey City riots, a disorderly conduct, arrests set off accusations of police brutality. And then Dixmoor race riot, Dixmoor, Illinois, Philadelphia race riot, August 28th. So here we have a whole bunch of them, again and again and again, race riots. Selma to Montgomery marches and Bloody Sunday. The Selma to Montgomery marches were 3 protest marches held in 1965 along the 54-mile highway from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. The marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of segregationist repression. They were part of a broader voting rights movement underway in Selma and throughout the rest of the South. On Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, some 600 civil rights marchers headed east out of Selma on US Route 80. They got only as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge 6 blocks away, where state and local lawmen attacked them with billy clubs and tear gas and drove them back to Selma. By highlighting racial injustice, they contributed to passage that year of the Voting Rights Act. Probably would not have been passed if it were not for the violence that took place.
Will not in any way be interfering with the pursuit of traffic. Detrimental to your safety. Continue this march and I'm saying it just as unlawful assembly. You disperse, you are ordered to disperse, go home or go to your church. This march will not continue. Here, the band poetry group say that they disperse.
And what's happening is by this time, people in their homes in America, virtually all have televisions and watch the news. And so for the first time, they're seeing policemen beating people aggressively. They're seeing water hoses used. They're seeing horses used. It creates a great deal of sympathy for the civil rights cause. So Watts Riot, sometimes referred to the Watts Rebellion, this is in Los Angeles in the summer of 1965. And again, simply a motorist is pulled over for reckless driving. Roadside argument breaks out, which then escalates into a fight with police. Community members reported that the police had hurt a pregnant woman and 6 days of civil rights unfold. Nearly 4,000 members of the California Army National Guard helped to suppress the disturbance. 34 deaths, 40 million in property damage. It was the worst until the Rodney King riots of 1992. Still more race riots in 1967. It's called the Long Hot Summer of 1967. 159 race riots, almost all African American. Cincinnati, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Newark, New Jersey, Plainfield, New Jersey, Cairo, Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, Cambridge, Maryland, Saginaw, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. April 4th of 1968 precipitates the April 4th to the 14th riots, including one in Detroit, one in New York City, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Illinois, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, Cincinnati, Ohio, Kansas City, Missouri, Wilmington, Delaware, Trenton, New Jersey, Miami, Florida. Then we have the famous Democratic National Convention of 1968. Protest activity during the Vietnam War took place prior to and during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. 1967, counterculture and anti-Vietnam War protest groups had been promising to come to Chicago and disrupt the convention, and the city promised to maintain law and order. For 8 days, the protesters were met by the Chicago Police Department in the streets and parks, and the protest climaxed in a major report said was a police riot the night of August 28, 1968. In this particular clip, you will want to notice the expression on Mayor Daley's face as he is being confronted with the truth of what's happening by Abraham Ribicoff. who is giving the nomination speech.
I look at the confusion in this hall and watch on television the turmoil and violence that is competing with this great convention for the attention of the American people. There is something else in my heart tonight, and not the speech that I'm prepared to give. George McGovern is President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. With George McGovern, we wouldn't have a National Guard. How hard it is to accept the truth. It is a great honor to nominate for the presidency of the United States, George McGovern.
Yes, Mayor Daley was very unhappy with that particular speech and what was happening at that point. Then for Stonewall Riots took place June 28th, 1969, Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village part of Manhattan. And this is the beginning, they usually attributed for that. There are other riots that took place before, but the modern fight for LGBT rights in the United States. Gay Americans in the 50s and 60s faced an anti-gay legal system. And we wanted to prove that gay people could be assimilated into society, and they favored non-confrontational education for homosexuals and heterosexuals alike. The last years of the 60s, however, were contentious as many social political movements were active, including the civil rights movement, the counterculture of the 60s, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. By 1979, we have on October 14th, the nation's first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. Then this sad incident, the Kent State shootings, a massacre. It was the shootings of 13 unarmed Kent State University students in Kent, Ohio by the Ohio National Guard May 4th, 1970. The killings took place during a peace rally during the expanding involvement in the Vietnam War into neutral Cambodia by the United States military forces, as well as the National Guard presence on campus. The incident marked the first time that a student had been slain in an anti-war gathering in the United States history. Part of the significance of the Kent State is that instead of our guns being aimed at enemies overseas, they were being aimed at our own citizens and young college students at that. And so it provoked a tremendous reaction and tremendous sympathy. 67 rounds fired over 13 seconds, killing 4 students, wounding 9 others. And one of them ultimately is permanently handicapped, and so permanent paralysis. It was a sad, sad event, one of the saddest in American history. And more race riots. New York, at York, Pennsylvania, 1969, Jackson, Mississippi in 1970, Attica prison uprising in New York, a shooting of Clifford Glover in South Jamaica, Queens, Boston busing race riots. Now the Indians of America, the Native Americans, are not exempt. We have the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, when approximately 200 Oglala Lakota, followers of the American Indian movement, seized and occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, one of the poorest places then and now in America. And this was a great, they actually apprehended a gunpoint and took hostage 10 of the residents, 10 or 11 of the residents. And it was a time of real tension and agony. Protests criticized the United States government failure to fulfill treaties with American Indians people, and demanded their reopening of treaty negotiations to hopefully arrive at fair and equitable treatment of Indians. It has become somewhat better, but there are still issues that are unresolved with the Native Americans in this country. 1976-77 marches on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment began and now brought 16,000 supporters to Springfield, Illinois, and later 4,000 in 1977 marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. They want to get Carter to take a more active role in efforts to ratify the ERA. They donned jogging shoes for the first part of raising money for this cause. 100,000 people marched in Washington in 95-degree heat, and they wanted the extension of the time to vote on the ERA. The ERA was given, as I recall, 7 years to be approved. It did not get the 2/3 of the votes in 7 years, so they extended it for another 3, and it still did not get the 3/4 that it needed to be ratified. There's still agitation out there to bring it back and try it one more time, but hasn't happened as of yet. New York blackout riot. New York had a blackout in 1977. Electricity blackout affected most of New York City for a couple of days. And there was very little in New York that was not affected. And of course, what happens when you have a blackout, as there had been in other places, is you get rioting and you get looting that takes place. And it was a lot of criminal activity, including some arson that takes place. March for Women's Lives, 1989. Now is April 1989. March for Women's Lives drew crowds that had not been seen in Washington since the Vietnam protests. They got a record-breaking 600,000 in April and another 350,000 in that fall. Later, they break their own record by bringing in 750,000 abortion rights supporters in April of 1992. Then there's a march on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation. That's in 1979. And supposedly they estimate that 1 million attended the march. Now, these estimates of numbers are often very inflated, but it was still very large. In April of 2000, the 4th march took place, and they say 800,000 appeared at that time. And on 2009, National Coming Out Day, believed to attract another 150,000 people to Washington, but on very short notice. So still more race riots. Miami in 1980, more riots in the Overtown area of Miami in 1989. Crown Heights riot in New York and Brooklyn, New York in 1991. In Los Angeles, the Rodney King riots in April and May of 1992. 1995, more than 200,000 people gathered in Washington on April 9th for the Rally for Women's Lives, the first and largest mass action to stop violence against women. They marched on April 14th, 1996, when over 30,000 women and men gathered in San Francisco to fight the radical right. Another million woman march, in which African American women filled the streets of Philadelphia with demands for justice and equality. And so it goes on. In 2004, and that was a major protest, and they guesstimate here well over 1 million people were involved in that. And then the Million Man March on Washington, an estimated 850,000 African American men from across the United States gathered on the National Mall. This surpassed the 250,000 who were there for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So a lot of people gathered. And at least I would say that one was in cooler weather. The Assembly of Black Men was organized and hosted by Nation of Islam controversial leader Louis Farrakhan, who called for all able-bodied African men to come to the nation's capital to address the ills of Black communities and call for unity and revitalization of African American communities. Woodstock Music Festival. We don't usually think of that as a protest area, but there were some violent actions that occurred during and after the Saturday night performance of Limp Bizkit. There were several sexual assaults. The band's vocalist Fred Durst stated during the concert, "Don't let anybody get hurt, but I don't think you should mellow out." And Alanis Morissette said, "Had you MF do, if someone falls, pick him up." Durst said to perform the band's hit song Nookie. We already have the Nigger J. Anyway, there was nasty stuff happening during all of this, and they were being violent in the process, tearing apart buildings and so forth. Annual pro-life March for Life. 2005, more than 1 million abortion rights activists again hit the ball in Washington as part of the March for Women's Lives. The annual March for Life rally. It's an inspiring, peaceful, vibrant, joy-filled rally of women, men, and young people, children from all across the country. Every year, tens of thousands come there on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which they want to have it overturned. And then the famous case of Elian Gonzalez, a little boy who came with his mother and her boyfriend to the United States, but in the process on the high seas, the mother was drowned. And the kid is then given to other relatives in the United States, his paternal relatives, to care for him. And they want to keep him. However, the United States courts have a system that says that biological parents have the greatest claim on any particular child. And so his father was alive in Cuba and wanted the child returned to him. And so Attorney General Janet Reno sent federal agents who took Gonzalez from the paternal relatives at gunpoint and returned them to his father in Cuba in June of 2000. So we have the effects of New Orleans of Hurricane Katrina. Huge, very fast, very strong Category 1 hurricane that does tremendous damage because it overruns the levees in floods about 80% of New Orleans, some parts as much as 15 feet of water. And the famous French Quarter and Garden District escape because they're above sea level, but most of the area in New Orleans was flooded. And of course, what follows that when some damage takes place is there is looting and so forth. Then there's Occupy Wall Street, which is an anti-corporation movement in 2011 in which a group of people protesting how poor and wealthy people have lived in different ways. And so they take over this small Zuccotti Park and they camp there. And there's a lot of sympathy and of course a lot of press. Protesters included a polyglot of people, communists, political moderates, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, many of them are there, but the whole theme is they're anti-corporate. And it spreads to other cities, though most of it takes place in New York. Eventually, the protests were largely peaceful, and some police officers were actually supportive, but after a few years, or a few months rather, it gradually dwindles away. And of course, the weather makes a difference in that too. Most famously, in terms of violence and protests, we have the murder of George Floyd, which takes place last year and results in protests around the world. And I can't help but tell you that every time I have seen the video where the officer has his knee on the neck of that poor George Floyd, my heart goes out to him because you can just see the life ebbing out of him as that's occurring.
For the 12th night in a row, a coast-to-coast call to action. Turning violent in Portland, Oregon, where police clashed with protesters well into the night. And in Seattle, where police appeared to clear protesters with flashbangs after the police chief ordered the suspension of tear gas and crowd control Friday. But those violent outbursts that often overshadow the beginning of this national inflection point, now mostly absent. Waves of peaceful protest marched on, bigger than ever before.
No more silence.
From Washington's newly named Black Lives Matter Plaza to San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, to Philadelphia, where one couple even stopped to get married. Meanwhile, police in Buffalo defending the use of force. Two officers were caught pushing 75-year-old Martin Gagino to the ground so hard he lay bleeding. Officers Robert McCabe and Aaron Tolgalski pleaded not guilty and were released on bail to the sound of cheers from fellow officers. In a show of support, 57 officers resigned from the Buffalo Emergency Response Team but remained on the police force. And as the protests surged across the world in his name, the family of George Floyd held a memorial in his memory.
In his living and in his dying, he has pleased God. He has woke all of us up.
At a public viewing, thousands lined the streets of Rayford, North Carolina, where Floyd was born, just for a glimpse.
Going in there, realizing that could be me, that could be my father, that could be my friend Rob, that could be anybody who looks like me.
We spoke to Floyd's grieving siblings.
I mean, that's our baby brother. And I can't go in and see him laying in a coffin. It would drive me crazy forever. Justice for Bree!
Meanwhile, the family of Brianna Taylor held a massive vigil in Louisville to acknowledge her 27th birthday. Taylor was shot and killed in her home during a police raid in March. Family, friends, and those fighting in her name ended the day by filling the sky with balloons, a belated birthday celebration for a lost lover, shared with a cry for justice.
When I first did this presentation, that was where I ended, because that seemed like that had covered enough. But as the last year has unfolded, I find that it never ends, that there's one after the other. Obviously, there are the Brianna Taylor protests that took place in May and September of last year. George Floyd's protests, which were, in fact, not only in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the second most destructive period of local unrest. Over a 3-night period, the cities experienced 2 deaths, 617 arrests, and upwards of 500 million in property damage, 1,500 locations, including 150 that were set on fire. And it was over a widespread area. But there was also the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in June, Kenosha unrest and shooting in August of 2020, Minneapolis False Rumors Riot, August, Red House eviction defense protests, the trial of Derek Chauvin and the protests that went along with that, Atlanta shooting protests in March, and most recently, the Dante Wright protests. It goes on and on and on, and most of it is racial. And then, of course, there is this.
Mayhem in the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday as swarms of protesters supporting outgoing President Donald Trump stormed the building in an attempt to force Congress to undo Trump's election loss. Police drew guns and fired tear gas after pro-Trump protesters marched through the halls of Congress. House members were told by police to lie on the floor and grab gas masks under their seats. Police said a woman had died after being shot at the Capitol. The National Guard was also deployed to the scene. Some lawmakers live tweeted the dramatic lockdown, one calling it surreal, another, Dan Kildee of Michigan, saying, quote, "This is not a protest, this is an attack on America." The chaotic scenes unfolded after Trump addressed thousands of protesters and repeated false claims that the election was stolen from him due to widespread fraud.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when it's
Trump also applied fresh pressure to Vice President Mike Pence, who had been presiding over the joint session of Congress and had to be escorted from the Senate, to unilaterally reject state electoral college votes.
And I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so.
Trump later posted a video on Twitter in which he repeated his unsupported claim that the election was stolen from him, but called for peace and told his supporters to go home.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people.
Outside the Capitol, members of militia groups and far-right groups summoned body armor mingled with the crowds. President-elect Joe Biden said it was an unprecedented assault on U.S. democracy and called for the siege to end.
It's not protest, it's insurrection.
And the head of a business group that represents 14,000 companies, including ExxonMobil, Pfizer, and Toyota, urged senior U.S. officials to consider invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. Washington Mayor Muriel Bowers ordered a citywide curfew that began at 6 p.m.
And so that is the story of some of the protest and some of the anguish that we have experienced as a nation over these last several hundred years. It is a sad state, it's not a sad statement to make that we are a violent nation. And protest is part of being, unfortunately, as American as apple pie. I would hope that we would not always be that way. I am not violent personally, and I've experienced very little violence in my life. But I hope for the harmony and the peace that is the potential of this great democracy, this great republic that we have. If we would just treat each other with kindness and respect and dignity that we need to use. Is there systemic racism in our country? There's no question there's systemic racism. All you have to do is get to know a few people of other colors, of the brown and black, and of those who are from other cultures, whether it be Asian or African or no matter what part in the world that they come from. And once you get to know them, you will find out how they are discriminated against and how sad it is, and why, in fact, that can lead to, when people feel frightened, that can lead to protest, and it can lead to reaction. In any event, I hope that this was a helpful discussion, a hopeful presentation for you, and I look forward to another time when you can join us for one of these presentations, and I hope you will find them instructive and helpful in many, many ways. Anyway, my pleasure to have presented this for you, and I hope that you have a fantastic day and life.